I think your country's making the right decision, but that's why we're here to find out. I hope you convince me before it's over. When East Germany joined with West Germany, weren't there lots of problems? I mean, did it help the East Germans that much? Did it help the West Germans that much?
Yes, well, whenever you have a union of this kind of size, with the kind of diversity of people that join the union, there are winners and losers. What it will mean is a total change of the economic geography of Europe. Before the Second World War, Czechoslovakia used to produce more goods than Austria. Estonia had higher exports than Finland. What it will mean is that a lot of centers of prosperity will move towards the east again, that the whole geography will change very dramatically. In 10-15 years' time, when you drive between Frankfurt and Moscow, you may hardly notice any difference on the way. Whereas 10 years ago, it was like day and night between Western Europe and Russia.
But you talk about how the markets have gone up, and they have, but that's partly because Tony and other CEOs have been putting more money into the East Europe and Central Europe, but that's already happened. What happens now?
Well, it will continue because the price level is still very low compared to, say, Western Europe. And so I think that over time there will be an arbitrage. People will move from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. They will assimilate in Western Europe. They will lower the cost of certain products and services, like if you build a house or you redo your house. Eastern European workers will do the job for much lower wages than Western European workers. That will increase the purchasing power of most households in Europe. In other words, their real purchasing power will move up and their standards of living will move up.
But aren't the unions already screaming, we don't want these Eastern Europeans in here, these Central Europeans in here?
Yes, I mean, I was in Warsaw last week at the occasion to celebrate the unification. But the point I made there, please do not emulate the bad habits which we have in Western Europe, which is high taxes. I mean, you know that in the EU, we take 44% in taxes out of the system, and as the quality of government is deteriorating, we are redistributing that money continuously in a poor fashion, with a poor return on that money. Now, it was telling that the Chancellor of Germany and the Prime Minister of Sweden only last week urged Eastern European countries to increase their taxes. If they would do that, they would kill off economic growth and prosperity in these countries. The low tax rates there, of course, are an incentive for foreign direct investment, and it will develop economic activity, and eventually we will all benefit. Now, I know that the average European citizen at this moment in time doesn't agree. About half of the people fear the unification because exactly they are afraid that they'll take away our jobs, that they will be prepared to work for lower wages. But we haven't seen that occurring when Spain joined, when Portugal joined, when Greece joined, when Ireland joined. These are now all shining examples of people who have drastically increased their standards of living.
Mark and I have discussed many times the poor quality of governments around the world in the last 40 years. Politicians are just not what they used to be, at least what we read in the history books. But these new governments you're bringing in, they're worse. You know, do you think that the government of Poland, which is full of scandals and deficit spending, is that better than, is that going to bring the standard of government up in Europe?
Well, two remarks. First of all, they learn, yes. There's no doubt about it that if you see the learning curves, if you would compare the quality of Polish government now with 10 years ago, there is a dramatic improvement. And secondly, there is a case as well to keep taxes low, because in a situation where taxes are lower, you're not relying on governments to redistribute that money. You will keep the money in society, and society usually has a very good inkling to know what to do with money.
Yes, actually, again, I have to agree with Tony, because first of all, if you talk about bad government in Eastern Europe, yeah, at least if they're bad, they at least cost less than Western European government. So, I mean, that is already an advantage. Secondly, for years and years, people said, oh, how bad the Chinese government is. As it turns out, the Chinese government is like a genius compared to the US government. And so I think these Eastern European countries, they are quite pragmatic and they can improve. At least they see the opportunity to attract business as a result of low taxation.
Right, but back to the labor things. Are the Western European governments going to let the Eastern European or the Central European laborers come here and work?
But I tell you something. The choice for Europe is very simple. And that's why I'm very positive for this Eurozone. Either the Eastern European workers come to Western Europe or business will move to Eastern Europe and the unions will lose their power. This is the most important step in Europe, that the unions finally lose their power the way they lost their power in the United States. If that doesn't happen, either as a result of business moving to Eastern Europe or as workers coming into Western Europe, then Europe will have no manufacturing left anymore because everything will be done in China.
Well, that
is the choice.
Let's go to that, because you both have said there's going to be a new revitalized Europe. But you have a horrible demographic problem in Europe. There are no babies being born here. And the new 10 countries have even a worse demographic record than the Western 15 countries do. How is Europe going to revitalize itself?
Well, one of the reasons that we have a low birth rate in Europe is it's very expensive to have babies. Yeah. Secondly, in Eastern Europe...
That's true everywhere.
In Asia it's not that expensive to have babies. In Eastern Europe, and the divorce laws are very unfavorable in Western Europe. That would have to change so that people would again be more inclined to be married because the risk would be lessened. But in, say, Eastern Europe and in Russia, the birth rate was very low because of economic conditions. If economic conditions improve...
But Spain was poor, as Tony points out. They got much more prosperous. They have the lowest birth rate in Europe.
Look, you're right in pointing out for potential dangers, yes? And there are two major dangers for Europe in the future. First of all, on the political side, we have to get our governance in Europe right, which means a democratic Brussels. So the constitution has to be not only efficient in terms of decision-taking, but we must make sure it's democratic. Because if it's not democratic, the European people will turn their back to Europe and will go back to their countries and their villages. And I think that for Europe in this world would be a disaster. The second fear I have is that the so-called Lisbon agreements, 4 years down the road, nothing has happened. In fact, if anything, we've gone backwards. The gap with the US has widened in economic terms, and of course, places like India and China are really sprinting ahead. So we have to have a fundamental relook the way we conduct our economies. And this extremely high welfare state, social welfare state, which we have built, which, by the way, the price tag is very high taxes, will, on a global basis, not be sustainable. So that is going to be one of the very difficult processes Europe will have to go through over the next 10 to 25 years, is that we have to make and build our economies in a more competitive scene.
I couldn't agree more, because you have this huge social welfare system, call it what, social safety net, what you will, but you don't have any young workers coming in because there's nobody being born. How does Europe survive? Under present projections, there will be no Spanish in 100 years.
Well, you're absolutely right. So let's have a look again at the birth rate, which I agree with you, is approaching to a point where we can say it's becoming a disaster. Some projections show that in 30 years' time, the average age in Europe will be 15 to 20 years older than in the US. So we are approaching a disaster scenario. But let's analyze why people don't want babies anymore in Europe. Well, first of all, and I agree with you, having children is very expensive. Secondly, with our elaborate social welfare states, we in a way have replaced the family. In the old days, if you had a problem, you would go to your brother or your sister, your mother, or to your child. Nowadays, governments are saying, come to me, because I have a social worker for this problem, and I have another expert for that problem. And what we need to do again is say to the people of Europe, look, you are smart, you're intelligent, you take charge of your own life.
But most people don't want to give up those benefits which they've been promised. I agree with you. They're outrageous benefits. But how are you going to say to them, we're not going to give you what you promised?
Well, it's something very simple. What we need in Europe is leadership. People who can explain in clear terms to the people of Europe, look, short term there will be pain. However, longer term, the gains will outweigh that For that, you need leadership.
Do you see any on the horizon? You don't have to name names if you don't want to, but